Welcome to the Australian Hiker Podcast, Australia's longest running hiking podcast, downloaded over 500,000 times in over 145 countries and providing you with an Australian perspective on all things hiking. We're your hosts, Tim and Jill Savage.
This is episode 219 of the Australian Hiker Podcast. And in this week's episode, we learn all about rail trails. Before we get into today's episode, if you'd like to help support Australian Hiker and this podcast, there are a couple of ways that you can help us out. Firstly, by subscribing on your podcast host of choice so that each episode is available as soon as it's published. And if you have the opportunity, leave us a 5-star review. Another way to support us is go to the Australian Hiker website at www.australianhiker.com.au and click on the Support Us page and buy us a coffee. You can do a one-off donation or become a monthly supporter. All donations are greatly appreciated and help us to continue producing this podcast and blog. Now let's get on to today's episode. I recently had to reschedule a multi-day hike for logistical reasons, and after spending some time looking for a replacement trail, I decided to do one of Australia's many rail trails. These unique trails had long been on my list of trails to do, and now is the time to pick and choose. But what are rail trails, and why do many hikers not even think about them as an alternative to going bush? In this week's episode, we catch up with Damian McCrohan from Rail Trails Australia to find out what you've been missing if you don't consider these as part of your hiking adventures. So I'd like to welcome Damian McCrohan from Rail Trails Australia to the Australian Hiker Podcast. Damian, thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
It's great, Tim. Nice to have this opportunity.
So, Damian, what's your role with Rail Trails Australia?
I'm president of Rail Trails Australia, which is a predominantly voluntary organisation that's promoting the development and, more importantly, the use of rail trails all around Australia.
Now, what's your general background? Are you a hiker or a biker? What sort of use do you get out of the rail trails?
Two things. I've always had an interest in railways and the development of Australia, and cycling as well from early days, just to get around town and go and look at railways. So, and I use them now for commuting and that sort of thing. Yeah, the bikes, I come at it from a biking and railway history point of view. But for instance, in our organisation, there's certainly lots of hikers involved as well.
Okay, now, in a nutshell, what are rail trails?
So rail trails are multi-purpose paths for walking, bicycle riding and horse riding on former railways or besides active railways. Predominantly they're on former railways that have been closed due to not being useful anymore. But there are some that are beside, active tourist heritage railways or even mainline railways, commuter railways. And they've got the advantage of being former railways. The railways were built very for steam trains, so they had easy gradients and spectacular. And to keep those gradients, quite often big cuttings or big embankments, so they're quite spectacular. So especially for cyclists, they're great because you don't have those steep gradients away, on the roads or other cycling tracks. And I guess that's an advantage for hikers too. It's a nice, easy walk. You don't have any steep ups and downs.
I must admit, I'm looking at some of the images in the guidebook. There's some spectacular bridges infrastructure on some of these trails as well.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's the other great thing about rail trails is they keep that heritage, and bridges are one of the most obvious visible signs, and they're a real feature of rail trails. And quite often in towns, in some other areas, there's the old stations as well. And rather than having them, there was a bit of a concern before rail trails come along. 25. They're only a recent phenomenon, really, in the last 25 years, and they provide a reason to keep that heritage, especially in the towns and the stations. And there's an increasing focus on revitalising the old railway precincts. And just recently, like literally a couple of weeks ago on the Great Southern Rail Trail in Gippsland, West Gippsland, the council announced funding from themselves and the state government of several $1 million to revitalise some station precincts in Leongatha and Korumburra. And it's also happening in, say, South Australia, particularly in other station areas. So, yeah, you've got those fantastic bridges, the station areas. So there's a whole history of what's gone before.
Now, is that a usual thing that they do try and maintain the infrastructure where it's safe to do and where it's practical to do?
Definitely, yeah. That's a real part of the attraction of rail trails. Though bridges are more of an issue, particularly wooden bridges, because they cost an awful lot to repair, to refurbish, and then they're an ongoing maintenance issue. So sometimes they'll go round bridges, and you'll see that on some rail trails like the East Gippsland Rail Trail. There's some massive wooden bridges there, but they're just too expensive to make safe to pass over, so you actually go beside them, and that's probably a better way of actually seeing them sometimes. And another good example is the High Country Rail Trail from Wodonga up to Shelley, where there's some super tall bridges, but the cost of refurbishing them is just too much. They have done some of them where you have to go over a river, you can't go around them, but where there's an opportunity to go around them, it's you get to stand back and see the amazing work that people did literally by hand 100 years ago. So and then there's some other ones which you'll see on the East Gippsland Rail Trail and High Country, the Great Victorian Rail Trail, many rail trails. You've got some of the more modern bridges which are also pretty spectacular. The one across Lake Hume is 660 metres long on the High Country Rail Trail.
Looking at the images, there are some spectacular bits of infrastructure on some of these trails. Now, are there different types of trails? I mean, is there what you'd class as a standard rail trail, or they're all slightly different?
Oh yeah, that's the amazing thing is that there's more than 100, over 100 in Australia. Technically, I think we count 144 just looking at our sheet. Just to sidetrack, we have regional representatives, volunteers all over Australia that communicate with all the groups and the managers of the rail trails, the friend groups. So some are managed by the councils, some are managed by local government departments, and some are managed by volunteers. So every rail trail is different in the way they're managed, literally. And then, the standard of the rail trail also varies. So some are super high quality with, sealed bitumen or even asphalt surfaces, even concrete in places, whereas others are more emerging or deliberately low key with that. But then there's a step down to really nice gravel surfaces. Then some are even lower, and they're more for mountain bikes or horse riding or definitely for hiking. They're fine for hiking. So you've got there's a whole range. And then obviously the lengths vary. You've got some that are only a few kilometres long, and the longest in Australia is the Brisbane Valley Rail Trail, which is 160 kilometres long.
That's a decent distance.
Does that answer your question? Does that answer? A whole huge range of rail trails. And, of course, the scenery they go through as well. Some are in urban landscapes. Some are very remote, like the East Gippsland, very remote bushland, So you get the whole gamut.
And by the sound of it, they spread reasonably well throughout the country. I'm guessing in some respects they'll probably be focused around the main population centres. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's sort of true. I guess Victoria is the most developed rail trail state in Australia, and just New South Wales has only really one real rail trail, just because of they're almost unique in the world in their slow development of rail trails. And then other states are also advanced, and most of them are branch lines. The old branch lines that closed in the 70s and 80s. So you'll see a sort of like the railway still there, then there's spines coming off there, and some go through major regional centres, and others are quite remote, like the High Country Rail Trail and even the East Gippsland Rail Trail. As you say, they're sort of spread where the population was originally, and to service all the farms and that were there.
I know, looking at some of the news that I get from New South Wales government and others in New South Wales, they've got a proposed rail trail not too far north of Canberra. I keep on seeing the news of it. It keeps on cropping up every so often, but I don't know what the end date is. But it looks like it's a 30 to 40 kilometre one they're proposing in the next few years. But
yeah, that would be the Crookwell one. I imagine.
That's the one. Yeah,
Goulburn, Crookwell. Yeah, and they've. Yeah, I don't know if you want to get into it in this interview, but there's unique sorts of legislation and hurdles in New South Wales to getting rail trails developed, which is a shame because there's some enormous potential in New South Wales. So the only real rail trail is the Tumbarumba to Rosewood Rail Trail near Wagga Wagga.
As we were setting up this interview, you indicated that many people use these trails for walking. And now, as best as you can possibly identify, how do people use the rail trails? What's the sort of, have you got any indication whether it's walking, cycling, horse riding, or it's sort of an even sort of spread?
So we do gather statistics from some rail trails. Count users as a way of justifying the expenditure on them, and also to plan for maintenance and provides data. A few of them actually some of the counters are smart enough to differentiate between walkers, riders, and like walkers, cyclists, and horse riders, but most of them can't. So my comments are more going to be anecdotal, and generally the biggest users of rail trails by number are walkers. But they're mostly local people, which is fantastic. That's what we love. Mostly just local people walking for recreation, in their towns, shorter distances, just going for a walk, getting exercise, particularly during lockdown, during the COVID lockdowns.
Yeah.
We've seen a huge increase. Walking their dog, walking to school, and that sort of thing. Then the biggest users... And that's so quite often in towns, the quality of the trail will be higher to allow the whole community to use the rail trail, even the mobility scooters, that sort of thing. But the biggest users of rail trails between towns are touring, and that's where the dollars are sort of seen, is the cyclists, because they're a safe off-road way of seeing the countryside.
Yeah.
And then horses on some rail trails are quite big users. The Brisbane Valley Rail Trail has a lot of horse riders on there, doing multi-day rides. But we are seeing an increased number of hikers using rail trails. And, what might only be a day on a bike can be a wonderful 3 or 4 day hike on a rail trail, and, stopping at the towns along the way. We've had quite a few articles in our magazine in the last couple of years, from hiking groups that do multi-day trips. One was on the Brisbane Valley Rail Trail. I think early this year we had one which was on the Murray-to Mountains from Beechworth to Bright in northeast Victoria in the Alpine country. And that was sponsored from a mental health point of view. And it was walking for I forget the actual term, but walking for mental health. So that was fantastic, and it was all organised. There was accommodation along the way, support vehicles, but there are private groups doing lots of walks as well, and staying and enjoying the accommodation along the way.
No, I was going to say, and that sort of leads into, in some respects we've already talked about it. You're saying a lot of locals will use the rail trails wherever they happen to be. Is it mainly the urban rail trails that are getting the use, and the longer trails tend to be really the locals and that's it, or are people starting to discover from further afield that there are rail trails they can access?
It's a combination of both. Like on absolute numbers, again, obviously the rail trails closest to big population centres are the most well used, because there's a bigger local population and they're closer for visitors to get to. So we have figures, the Lilydale to Warburton Rail Trail, which is on the outskirts of Melbourne, it ends at where the electric train stops, and it wanders up for 40 kilometres up to Warburton in the mountains with valleys, very picturesque, lots of little towns along the way. That gets over 250,000 people a year using that one because it's close to, it's on the edge of Melbourne, and ticks all the boxes basically. And then as you get further away, the use drops off. But what we find for walking is that, the locals, it's consistent through every town. The locals love using rail trails. It's a health thing, mentally and physically, and also for, the kids getting to school, etc. Yeah, that's how they've used basically.
All right. Now, what do you have a favourite rail trail and why?
Oh, I better be careful what I say here. Yeah. I guess there's some, where I've lived when I grew up, I guess there's some, I do like some, but I guess I can't say there's a favourite because there's all different aspects. There's the scenery along, some will have scenery, some will have facilities. So I better not say I have a total favourite, but I guess one to stick out is the High Country Rail Trail because I grew up in that area and was involved from many decades ago, and there's also some spectacular scenery. But there's other ones that have some marvellous facilities along the way. And I guess, to say a recent one, my favourite one this year, so to speak, is the new section of the Great Southern Rail Trail, which I mentioned down in Gippsland, South Gippsland. Again, fantastic scenery from Nyora up to Corumburra and Leongatha. And, it just winds through the not mountains, but the hills, and because the trains, again, couldn't just go over a hill like cars do.
Yeah.
So it winds up this valley right away from the highway in wonderful scenery. And I guess it also means something to me because I actually rode the trains when I was in my college years, because that was only closed in the 1990s, that one.
Yeah.
And actually, so you can still visualise some of the history. And again, the stations, there's some fantastic stations that are going to be developed there, lots of bridges. So, and the communities along the way, great little towns like at Lock and that sort of thing. Yeah, that's my favourite this year, I guess.
I must admit, it's a bit like that. It's if you're focusing
next
one
year. And next year, the north, there will be another rail trail opening in New South Wales, hopefully at the end of this year. But they've had some shocking floods, up at Willumbar and that sort of area, Byron Bay. So, but that's going to be absolutely fabulous as well. There's some wonderful scenery, 3 tunnels just in 20 kilometres. 15, 16 bridges, wonderful scenery again away from the highway and freeways. So I think that'll be my next favourite next year, basically.
Tell us a bit about that Rail Trails Australia. What sort of services do they provide?
Yeah, so we're, as I mentioned at the start, we're a voluntary organisation that predominantly voluntary. We have one part-time admin person that we've been involved in promoting the development and the use of rail trails since about 1996. So what's that, 26 years now. And originally, nobody knew what they were 26 years ago. What the hell's a rail trail? And it's repurposing of those disused, abandoned eyesores and into wonderful community facilities. So all the rail trails, almost every rail trail has not been driven from the state or federal government. They've been driven by the local community. And they said, well, we want to, we've heard about these rail trails. We want to do something for our community and have this wonderful asset. So it's a hard work for them. Everything takes a long, long time. So we provided the information and examples to them and documentation and support to help all those local groups who then, get the state government involved, get the council, local government involved, and you got to bring all those people along. And there was a lot of opposition as well. A lot of people were opposed. What anything new is concerning, and particularly adjacent landholders in rural areas. They didn't want people walking through their, what they regarded as their property, even though it is public land, of course. But they sort of viewed it as their property because they're quite often on both sides of the old railway corridor.
Yeah.
So we support a lot of that. And along the way, once we got some developed, then you had to encourage their use, to show they are successful. So in the old days, before the internet, we produced guidebooks, which was the only way, and we've sold, before the internet, 20 or 30,000 guidebooks, which indicates how popular they are. And obviously now we have our website is the main means of communication to supporters to provide information about, where to ride a rail, walk, ride, horse ride a rail trail, and again, increasingly trying to get the services to support people using rail trails. And we still do guidebooks as well. So yeah, we have, I think, 20 regional reps around Australia communicating with the rail trail managers. Some rail trails have friends groups, which is really great. So the local government does the essentials of keeping the rail trail in good condition and maintained, but then friends groups do other things like revegetation of the corridors is a really big thing for a lot of people, and you'll see that when you go out in a rail trail, or you might notice, but yeah, there's been a lot of revegetation to bring back native bushland, and then they'll also put in rest stops like seats, shelters, and you'll see that on the East Gippsland Rail Trail as well.
Yeah.
So we're sort of the peak body bringing all those people together and communicating, and we have social media as well, of course, these days.
All right, no, that's good. It sounds like it sounds like you do a great service, and as you say, for me, I've been aware of rail trails for a number of years, and they're on my list of things to do. It's just a convenient timing and a convenient bringing together that
Right.
That's what I will be doing over the coming weeks.
I'm sure you'll love it. And then, as you know, you've got as once you get this one, you get hooked on it, you'll have heaps more to do coming up. And there's over 1,000 kilometres of rail trail in Victoria, and that's increasing in the other states too, and particularly Queensland. They're going to have 400 or 500 kilometres open hopefully next year or two.
So I was going to say, what would you say to keen bushwalkers considering these unique trails as an alternative to going bush?
They're obviously different. They're far. As I said, the rail trails typically are well maintained, and they have a nice smooth surface. So they're not, and they're 3 or 4 meters wide. So you definitely feel, on a sort of road, so to speak, former railroad.
Yep.
So not the same close, intimate thing as a hike in the bush, but there's still, as I said, there's a lot of vegetation and a lot of shade being grown on rail trails now. They're not just bare paddocks like they used to be, and some do go through bushland and native national forest or state forest as well. But they give you a different experience, I guess. And you've got, as we discussed, there's the history. This is not just a walk just because it's a nice area. This was vital to opening up and the community and the state or the country, and provided an essential means of communication and transport for people, even up to 20 or 30, 40 years ago. That's the only way they could travel and transport, get all their transport in, all their goods in, and get them out. And they're a great way. You would people stage their hikes, depending on the towns and how far they can get each day, which you would know, of course. But you can get to experience, the local. Every town is different, and you actually get to enjoy the towns. You also see quite often farming operations and how where all our produce comes from. So it's a different idea, but it really gets you perhaps more involved in what's going on in the community in regional Australia. And there's also the urban rail trails as well. There's some that are quite long. There's certainly great potential there, and they're a safe off-road, generally quiet way of experiencing the countryside.
That's great. So we've been talking with Damian McCrohan from Rail Trails Australia. Damian, thank you for taking the time to talk to Australian Hiker.
No problem, Tim. Great to be able to talk with you about it.
All right, so that was an introduction to rail trails. And from my perspective, this had been something on my list of things to review and things to walk at some stage in the undetermined future. And for me, I'll talk about it in a minute, there's a very specific reason for bringing this to everyone's attention now. But just going back over the episode in talking to Damian, I think a lot of people are aware of the term rail trail. They may have heard of it, but they probably don't really know what it is and what they do. So, put simply from Damian's perspective, really it's just you're walking along old railway infrastructure in most cases, either where they've removed the rails and the corridors are still there, or potentially you're even still walking down trails that still have the occasional steam locomotive. And I think a lot of Australians are used to seeing the historic steam trains that occasionally hit the rail tracks. Or, as Damian said, sometimes it's still actively used rail corridors, and you're obviously not walking down the middle of the tracks.
That's handy.
That's handy, yeah. But you are walking close by them. And I think it's interesting listening to what he was saying. I mean, I must admit, I didn't have a picture. I had a picture of walking down old disused rail tracks, and I've actually done that on the Bibbulmun track, in fact, and even on the Human Hovel. There's old sections of track you tend to use here and there, disused track. But from what he was saying is, particularly the tracks that have been decommissioned and that are no longer in use were ones that were made for steam locomotives, and they've obviously got a maximum gradient. So in a lot of cases, these are trails or tracks that aren't overly steep and don't go up the top of steep mountains. They do have a lot of switchbacks. They do have situations where they've put in big cuttings or bridges. So they're a relatively gentle gradient in most cases.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I haven't done a lot of walking along rail corridors, I guess. And, I've got a picture in my mind. I have done a few short ones around Rutherglen. It does add another dimension, and, that interest in trains probably helps. But I think it's also a much more diverse way of doing some hiking because, the rail corridors go in and out of small towns, and so you get to see a little bit more of life in rural Australia as well as the bush.
What surprised me was I really had no concept about how many rail trails there were in Australia. I just imagined they were everywhere. And Damian's saying there's approximately 144 trails, with a fair number of those in Victoria. So
that's quite a few.
Yeah, it is quite a few. And and there are some of them. I bought the guidebook and I bought the online guidebook.
Did you get the T-shirt though?
I didn't get the T-shirt, no, or the coffee mug. But I found that, it surprised me. And these trails vary. As I think Damian was saying from memory, the longest one was about 160-odd kilometres. The shortest ones might only be a couple of 100 metres long, and that's about it. There is a variety of trails that are there. And unless you're a real purist, these are just another possibility as far as a walking track is concerned. And they give people an option to go through and do trails that you may not have actually thought of.
And presumably, if you're not necessarily into the overnight camping, you've probably got a few more accommodation options as well, maybe at the beginning, maybe at the end. So it does add a bit of diversity, I think, to the hiking you might do.
Now, my main focus for discussing rail trails now, I was supposed to be finishing off the Human Hovel track
You're dreaming.
Yeah, in late May, early June, and I had time booked off. I've got time off work. I've got a fixed period that I can actually go. And the section of trail that I was planning on doing it's under repair at the moment. And that was going to create logistical problems for me that, if I had have waited another month or so, which is looking like what the case is now, I would have done that. So I went looking for a different option and try and find what was accessible and what was available in that sort of 4 to 5 days sort of category that didn't require huge logistics to get to and from the site. So for me, I have decided in the next week or so that I'll be doing one of the rail trails. And in fact, I'm actually doing the East Gippsland Rail Trail in Victoria, and obviously in East Gippsland. And that's going to be approximately just on 100 kilometres in length. So our next episode, episode 220, we're going to be providing an introduction to my trip, talking about my expectations and going into a bit more detail about logistics and how I've planned out what I'm going to be doing. So we hope you've enjoyed this introduction to Rail Trails. This, as I said, is the first in a series of 4. So if you listen through next week to our next episode, and the 2 episodes after that will take you through my trip as it happens, as well as the post-trip review of how I thought it went. That's all for this week. Bye for now.
And bye from me.